thank you so much for all being here. My name is Dr. Kerry McInerney. I co-chair the Global Politics of AI stream at the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence with Hayden Belfield, who's also here. And we look at how AI is impacting international relations. And so we're thrilled to be working with the Cambridge Centre for Geopolitics, who is hosting this event today, to think about the broader social and political impact of generative AI on the massive number of democratic elections that are happening this year. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Suzanne, who will introduce the panel and the panelists.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And I think now Sam is going to press the button, and we're going to have a sinister moment where a grill comes down. And you're now trapped, and you may not leave. Unless there's a fire, in which case, as Kerry said, there's 2 fire exits, and the muster point is on the lawn in the central quad. So, my name's Suzanne Rain. I work at the Centre for Geopolitics. I'm delighted that we're doing this event with the Centre for the Future of Intelligence with Kerry. Where's Kerry? Is she? Oh, sorry. I thought you'd gone.
Behind the screen.
Because I think everybody's talking about AI and the effect that it's having on the world and on political actors and on geopolitical actors. And we realised that you've got to get really interdisciplinary on this if you're going to start to be able to understand it. So what we've done, hopefully today, is we've assembled a panel that cuts across expertise in AI and in geopolitics and in elections and in press and the media. And hopefully we're going to have the conversation to end all conversations on this matter. I know that this is not necessarily an original topic, but it's a topical one, which is why everyone's talking about it. So I'm going to introduce our panel going left to right. We've got Professor Kieran Martin. Kieran is Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford. And before that, he was founding CEO of the UK's National Cyber Security Centre. And before that was in the UK government in a lot of very important civil service roles. Next to him is, I need to say this right, Dr. Nahema Marchal, is that roughly right? Who is now Socio-Technical Research Scientist at Google DeepMind, and she's a member of the Ethics and Society team. And before that, she did her doctorate at the Oxford Internet Institute, and she's interested in how AI and ethics and people movements work. I think that's right. So, yeah. And then on my right, we've got Mary Hockaday. Mary is Master of Trinity Hall here in Cambridge, and before that, ran the BBC World Service. Sort of short and sweet. And then finally, last but not least, Anita Williams. Anita is Trust and Safety Engagement Manager at Google's Safety Engineering Centre based in London. So we've got a real mix of real professional expertise across a range of different things. So I'm going to start by getting our panelists each to give us their view on what all these words mean, so we can work out what it is that we're actually talking about. And given that this was Anita and Mary's suggestion that we'd start by defining what we're talking about, I'm going to ask Anita to go first.
Sure. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. One of the most humbling parts of my job is meeting with civil society. Oh, just here? Okay, thank you. It's meeting with civil society and academics really around Europe to have these discussions on definitions. So in a lot of cases, AI as a definition really comes down to advanced machine learning for a lot of people. For others, it's the end of human civilization. And so we're meeting somewhere in the middle, hopefully more towards the former, when we talk about the ability of advanced models to be able to contextualize and synthesize information for consumption. And this is through a series of training, model tuning, fine-tuning, and safety precautions put in place. So a little wordy, but that's what I would describe AI as.
Mary.
So, as Suzanne has already said, there's a lot of conversation going on about AI, and I'm really delighted to be here today to listen to this one actually and take part. And I think the term AI does get used sometimes really precisely, especially in academic circles, but really quite loosely in other circles and by the public. In one way, I think it's come to just mean anything where technology is sort of part of it. And that might be in creation, but it very much can be part of distribution of content as well. I think when you are then more precise and you come to advanced machine learning or generative AI, really then we are focused more on the idea that technology, computers, computer programs, and algorithms, so mathematical calculations, are beavering away in the background and helping manage vast amounts of content or text or imagery, seeking patterns, putting things together, definitely helping or not helping actually with distribution and micro-targeting. And taking us to a sort of a different level of computing power working behind the scenes on things which have always been with us. There's always been fake news, there's always been disinformation, there have always been bad actors, there have always been clever ways to get certain content to certain people. But I do think for me and in this conversation, I will be sort of focusing on the ways that technology and advanced learning has exponentially grown these capacities in ways that are not always very visible to us.
Thank you, Mary. Nahema.
It's going to be very difficult for me to topple the two excellent definitions that were already given by my peers here, but I'll try to do my best to specify it. So I think, as was rightly pointed out, when we talk about AI systems, we tend to talk about it in a quite general term. But I think it's actually helpful to hone in on some of the specificities that characterize today's generation of frontier AI models. And so when we refer colloquially to generative AI, I think we talk about systems that are trained on billions of parameters and that are today more widely accessible than they were previously. They're often available to the public through user-friendly interfaces. They're more widely accessible as well to a wide range of actors that do not necessarily possess technical expertise. And we're also seeing increasingly the advent of multimodal capabilities within these models. And what that means is that the next generation of models does not only take things like text as input, but also things like images and videos, and is starting to show capabilities such as video or image understanding that do have ramification for the way in which we think about the information ecosystem and what people can actually utilize them for.
Well, there's absolutely nothing left for me to say now. So, I think Anita and Nahema gave very, very accessible and very good technical definitions, and Mary broadened it out to talk about the sophisticated and larger scale application of things that we can already do using those technical definitions. I think that kind of covers it. There is, we're at a moment where, I think Mary alluded to this, there's a lot of hype around it. I've just seen a brilliant cartoon, which is a bunch of academics on a luxury yacht, all in sort of swimwear, drinking Bollinger, and the caption is, "How did you get funding for this?" And then you notice the yacht is called AI. And indeed, sometimes there's a little bit of a backlash to this. I worked with an American military colleague who, when everybody says, "Well, use AI for this," he would go, "Oh, you mean sums?" So I think, from my point of view, because I don't have the technical expertise of either Nahema or Anita, I think it's most helpful, certainly when you're talking about something like this, to build on Mary's point, to talk about the applied use. So, AI has adapted for tonight in this specific purpose because it's now become such a gargantuan, all-encompassing term. I would say is the sophisticated and large-scale manipulation of information. That's what we're talking about tonight, I think.
Thank you. So this is brilliant. And this is going to be a conversation between experts, and if I direct it, that's just because there needs to be a director, but it's really important that you. So I think one of the possibly controversial elements of this is the assumption built into all these conversations is that AI is going to have some sort of influence on the elections this year, and we were halfway through the year already. So I propose that we spend a little bit of time saying, is this actually a problem for the year that we're living in right now? And I'm going to start again with you, Kieran, because you've done quite a lot of talking, and I think you're going to say, no, it's not actually a problem, are you?
Well, I would approach it from a slightly skeptical perspective in terms of getting extremely worried about it. And that's not just because of some of the evidence that we might debate, it's because of, my view is that getting very worried very publicly about electoral integrity because of AI is not a neutral act. And what I mean by that is, if you cast enough doubt in the public's mind about the integrity of their electoral system, even if you don't prove it, then some proportion of the population will start to believe you. And that in itself is very damaging. I also think that, I've worked with electoral interference attempts, and there are many. So I'm not saying nobody's trying to do this. Loads of people are trying to do this on an epic scale. To my mind, an unprecedented scale in democratic history. But there is a tendency, in my view, to conflate activity and intent with impact. And for me, I can think of only 2 electoral events in the last 10 years in democracies that I can think of were very significantly impacted by interference, and only one of them is to do with AI. So the first one is the 2016 election in the US, which isn't anything to do with AI. It's a cyber operation, hack and leak. And I'm not saying that the Russians got Donald Trump elected. I think that's an easy cop-out for very difficult factors in the modern fissured United States. But the fact that the American people are still arguing about it is a win for the Russians, because it further divided a divided society. And the other one, I think, because it's the one where an intervention, which is AI generated, it was an audio deepfake in Slovakia at the end of last year. And I'm not an expert in Slovak psephology, but it does seem to be that the polls moved. But there are other factors which I won't seize the floor, so there are other factors relating to that we might come on to. So it can happen, it does happen, but there's a very good quote from our old government colleague, Sir Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, in his valedictory interview with the Financial Times in September 2020, which I think is worth a read, where he said in his period as head of MI6, which was pretty much exactly the same as my period as head of the National Cybersecurity Centre, and I would concur entirely, he said he saw lots of this activity, but in the UK he'd never seen any activity that had any strategic impact at all in terms of major political interventions, and I would concur with that. And he also said, and this comes back to my point, that it's not a neutral act. He said, look, first of all, we have agency. We don't have to choose to be divided by these things. And secondly, if you talk it up, you do the potential aggressors work for them. So that's my slightly skeptical opening point. It's not to dismiss the risk. It's not to dismiss the deeply, just in some respects, disturbing technology. But it's just to put out there that worrying ourselves very publicly, very loudly, in a way that cuts through to people who are going to the polls in this country later this year and lots of other countries, has consequences in and of itself.
So don't worry, everybody. And this it's really important that the message you take away is that we shouldn't be worrying about this, because in a sense we are all talking about it, and therefore we're creating that buzz. Nahema, you were nodding when Kieran was speaking.
Yes, I was nodding because I agree with quite a lot of the points that were raised, and I think I would add a couple things. Of course, it's undeniable that we've already seen some of the ways that AI-generated content is being used in the context of elections and campaigns. Recently, whether that's Taiwan, Argentina, the US election, and more. And it's obviously an area where there's high societal concern, I think very understandably. But actually, from a research perspective, it's quite a complex question to answer, and I think we need to pay specific attention to the mechanisms that might be at play here. So what we know from the evidence, for example, is that although misinformation does abound online, when you look at it at the scale of the information ecosystem, actually the average online user doesn't really come across that much information, or at least not as much as people might expect. From the way in which it's reported, in the media, for example. And of course, there's a risk, and there needs to be more research to actually investigate that and try to quantify it, that the availability and sophistication of Gen AI tools may increase the volume of misinformation that's in circulation. That needs to be verified. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will be exposed to it or will consume it. We inhabit extremely rich and abundant informational ecosystems where people's attentions are pulled in different directions. And for information to be effective, it actually needs to reach people. The second thing I would flag, which is sort of related, is that we also know from decades of communication research that persuasion is actually quite hard. And so there's not a lot of empirical evidence at this stage that misinformation actually shapes voters' intentions and swing elections basically by dislodging people's very strongly held political beliefs. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that we should all go to bed and feel unconcerned. I think there are other aspects that should still be investigating, notably, as you pointed out, the impact on trust, for example, of inhabiting a world in which there are talks effectively about the integrity, and provenance and authenticity of content and what sort of effects that has on our politics and on democracy. And of course, follow very closely, developments as they unfold.
Thank you, Mary. Well, Anita, but I want to ask you some technical stuff, because we're talking about, so these two have basically said, don't worry. But I think before we conclude, don't worry, it would be quite helpful to think a little bit more about, there is a problem out there. There are people who are developing ever more sophisticated ways to create something to try and make you believe something that isn't true. And in a way, just to extend even our, this is a question really, but even our political parties have, as Mary said, they've been spending all their time since they started to exist working out how they could persuade you to vote for them rather than the other candidates. So the idea of, getting a hook to get people to change their intentions is nothing new. And now there's new capabilities.
Right. Yeah, so as both of you were speaking and very expertly on the scale of impact so far, as well as the scale of prevalence, maybe not so much prevalence, but definitely connection. It made me think from the trust and safety background that I do come from. I started in a content moderation capacity, then I moved on to policy development, and then further into threat analysis and intelligence. And when I think about AI as a problem, if we want to call it an objective problem, then coming from the policy perspective, and bear with me, there's a bit of explanation, at Google, there's a suite of policies that govern the products. So something like search, we expect that you expect to see every legal result pertaining to your query you get in front of you. And if it is illegal, then there are some nudges and ways that we can discourage that kind of behavior. And similarly, behavior like harassment or stalking or incitement to violence, that is not allowed on the platform in any product, whether it's ads or YouTube. So where AI becomes a really interesting tool as a problem is that it presents something that has been around, but it amplifies it. And that is something called borderline content. So borderline in that it comes right up against the line of policy governance or even legal codes. It's saying, I'm just posing a question, I'm sowing doubt, rather than making misleading, egregious, or demonstrably false claims about something, because then that violates the policy, right? So it comes up right up to that line, and it amplifies that at scale. So whether or not it has a hit rate, a high hit rate with users, that's something that we're continuing to look into. But where that, I think, becomes really interesting, as we've seen in the Slovakian example, we also saw this in the New Hampshire primary, where there was a series of robocalls imitating Joe Biden's voice, discouraging voters from voting in that primary. And that was, I think, 3 weeks before the actual election. Right now, in India, there are live elections where there's been a video propagating, imitating the voice pattern of the Home Affairs Minister, discouraging certain kind of belief in the integrity of voting machines, right? And so that's something where if there is a hit rate, right, if there is a high, moderate, or even low hit rate, that's something that over time continues to erode the trust in these pretty fortified institutions that we have to trust and hopefully are evidenced by their integrity that we should trust. So over time, as we see that develop, and in our threat analysis groups, we're tracking thousands, and quite literally thousands, of cybersecurity attacks, coordinated influence operations and information campaigns across the world. We actually publish that every quarter on a monthly or a quarterly bulletin. You know, we're seeing this increasing obfuscation of not just the owner of the action, but also what the direct consequence of this hit rate can lead to in the short term versus the long term. Because quite frankly, the erosion that we've seen over the last 10 years, it took 10 years for us to really kind of see it, right? It took 2016, 2015 in the case if we want to include Brexit and those campaigns. It took about 5 years for us to really understand the scope of these coordinated influence operations that hadn't even used AI at that point. So how are we going to measure that in the short term when it's already taken the long term that it has? So is this a problem in this way? Yes, right? We have the scale question, we have the owner of this behavior question, like who is it that is behind these campaigns? And then we have the time kind of quotient of how long will it continue to take us to understand each and every campaign that we're seeing in the way that it evolves. And we do have teams that work on this around the world, 24/7, different language capabilities, as well as different technical capabilities. And they're using AI to actually help with abuse fighting. And I can talk more about that later. But right now, those are the problems that we're seeing. And when it comes to the electoral process in particular, when we think about deepfakes and synthetic media, or when we think about, again, the scale of deployment, or even the discourse shaping kind of borderline content, those are the three kind of risk areas that we're paying attention to in trust and safety right now.
Discourse shaping.
Yes, I'm trying to decide whether I'm on the it's not a problem or it is a problem side, and you know, probably like a ex-BBC journalist, I'm going like this. I mean, I very much agree actually with Kieran about the risks of being sort of hysterical about it as a problem. But at the same time, I really don't think we should be complacent, and I do think we have to talk about it like this, and then be as factual and informative and do the research as possible. This, especially the recent phases of generative AI and machine learning and so on, sort of erupted so rapidly and recently and in a much bigger scale than we'd been used to, that I think it is sort of inevitable. We've had this phase of everybody wanting to try to catch up and understand and make sense of it, and some of that probably has been an overreaction. But I think overall we are right to be looking really carefully at this. You know, India is a very good example, but you can be nuanced about it. So absolutely, there have been examples of, you know, of deep fakes in the way you describe, where somebody apparently talking, a minister saying something different. There have been some with Bollywood stars apparently campaigning for one party or another. You know, bad, not good, may not fully know the impact of it, but just prima facie somehow not a good thing during an election. Machine learning or algorithms or micro-targeting technology has also been used, whereby I'm a politician, I want to campaign, I give my speech, I'm in India. People in India speak many languages. AI translates me and voice activates me into speaking my words, but in different languages, and then phones people up in an automated way and says, I think you should vote for me because my policies are the best. At the end, it says, this was brought to you by, you know, an algorithm or by machine learning. So there's a degree of transparency introduced, which I think has to be at least a first starting point with all of this. But still, you know, interesting. Is that just an efficient way of improving leafleting, which we were all used to from the past? And in some ways, you could argue yes. But does it take us so many steps further that we at least want to think about it, understand it, you know, research the impact of it? So I do think that we have to be wary, and we have to understand the intentions behind this. And in many cases, the intentions are really not good. And as Kieran and everyone is saying, they can be about disruption, they can be provoking distrust, they can be about provoking apathy, of which we know there is a great deal in democracies. So no room for complacency. Although at the same time, it's a very exciting technology, which is enabling lots of things.
So I want to pick up exactly on where you've left off on the question of the bad actor. And I think something, Anita, you said about resources, or maybe Kieran, but Kieran, who are the bad actors? Because it's not just, you have states who are just obviously, they don't really care who they support as long as they can be divisive. But you also have the examples we're talking about, elections in India. Are the bad actors simply campaigning for one party or another? Does that make it bad? And the reason I'm asking all these questions is that question about what kind of response is necessary in that sort of situation?
I'll answer those the other way around. I'll answer those the other way around because I was going to ask if you would allow me to come back on your don't worry, given that we've now, I think accidentally, unless you're, more of an evil genius than I thought, we've accidentally moved this into a Cambridge Union style 2x2 adversarial debate, which I don't think we'd planned. Because in terms of what we should do, I think it comes back to the don't worry point. The reason why I would slightly bristle, I am sceptical about the extent of some of this in terms of impact, not in terms of activity. The reason I would slightly bristle at characterising, my own position as don't worry is that not worrying depends an awful lot on the response, and a lot of the response is not technical. So the example I want to talk about, and I'm sorry I keep talking about the UK, but I know it much better than anywhere else. You may remember last November when the Gaza protests had started every Saturday in London. There was that very tense moment in mid-November around Remembrance Sunday, and a deepfake went into circulation, apparently of the Mayor of London, who is, of course, a Muslim, amongst many other things, purporting to say that who cares about remembrance marches, remembrance commemorations, it's all about making sure that the pro-Palestinian march can go through. Now, first of all, in terms of actors, I personally have no idea who is behind that, and I don't know if anybody does. I haven't seen any credible coverage. But that was, really evilly clever. First of all, technically it was pretty good, although I think we all know making deepfake audios is really easy now. It's and that genie's out of the bottle. But secondly, just as a sort of mastermind ploy, if you want to exacerbate divisions in the United Kingdom, it was really smart. So it was quite dangerous, but it had very little impact. And that was because of the actions, I think, of three different actors. One was the government, and not so much in the role as the government, well, just as much in the role of political opponents of the mayor. So the government came out within a couple of hours on every social media platform available and an official statement saying there's a deep fake circulating, don't pay any attention to it. Contrast that with what, say, the Trump campaign did with the Hillary Clinton stolen material in 2016, where they made as much of it politically as they possibly could. So there's a maturity there from the government, whatever one's position on the current government is. And they also, using their platform as government, as opposed to the Conservative Party, said, don't amplify it, don't look at it, don't listen to it. And so that was important. The second thing was the media, the mainstream media, which is still where an awful lot of people get their news, complied with this and said, well, we're going to report there's a deepfake, we're not going to broadcast it, and we're not going to give it any credence. And not a single media outlet, to my knowledge, fell for it in a way that amplified it and made it sound like there's a leaked video of Sadiq Khan saying the most incendiary thing you could imagine him saying. And the third thing was, on a day, yet again, where big tech's taking a bashing in this country, this is one thing I think big tech actually does quite well. They are alive to this, they do put significant resources around it. So as and when people did circulate it, it was taken down quite a lot. So, so that's that is the type of response, and none of those things, apart from arguably the latter, are particularly technical. Obviously, the more you invest in being able to detect it, the faster big tech can take it down. But the rest of it was a maturity of the society, which meant that I don't think, not least because the guy just won re-election by a landslide, I don't think anybody could say that it had any particularly important political impact, and very few people seriously believe he said anything like that. But if we just sort of stood there and let it swirl around, and some media had said, well, its authenticity is uncertain, but there could have been a very different picture, so we did have to have activity. This does bring me to actors, because the Cannes thing I genuinely don't know, and I think, you know, one of the things that has protected us from complete catastrophe and traditional cyber attacks, which I know better, is the costs of doing sophisticated business, which are quite high. So only organised people, tending to be nation states or organised criminals, with you know, can do it. But you know, that sort of stuff, quite a lot of people can do a decent job with relatively little effort. So I mean, as far as I know, the Cannes thing hasn't been linked to a particular state actor or anything, and it could be that you know, it could be somebody malicious acting on their own. I don't know. I do think we have to, you know, in terms of organised activity, I mean, Russia does remain the principal actor. I don't think it focuses specifically on AI deepfakes. It's just got a plan of electoral and political destabilisation in Western countries, and that could be cyber, it could be disrupting bits of electoral infrastructure, it could be deepfakes. I think sometimes we kind of lazily put China in the same bucket, and it's much more subtle about influencing, in my view, and it's much less keen not to be caught, and it has much less interest in actually just fomenting the type of disruptive dissent than Russia does. You say anything nuanced about China, some people accuse you of being, you know, overly dovish on it, but that would be my
Could I interrupt
assessment.
you to ask you about Taiwan? Would you say that's different in terms of Chinese engagement on
Yeah, I think they're much
Taiwanese
more careful in the
elections?
West, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I do think, you know, broadly speaking, a handful of nation states, but particularly Russia at the sort of more sophisticated end, and then there is this worry about people, you know, just doing something sort of quite specific and you know, acting on their own. But the really important thing is I think the response to it, which has so far blunted a lot of the impact.
Yep.
Thank you. I really appreciate you outlining what the response, what a successful response can look like, and what it did look like in the case of this example you gave. One area that I like to draw attention to is during the COVID-19 pandemic, when in the early days of the outbreak, there were a number of what we call information vacuums or voids. We just didn't have information. We didn't know how it spread, what were the primary vectors, what immunocompromised individuals should and could do to protect themselves, or at least diminish the negative impacts on their immune systems. And so in times of information voids, this is when rumoring starts. So rumors come out. And rather than being classified immediately as misinformation, or even further as disinformation, they're just rumors, they're speculations. There are people sharing firsthand accounts of, well, I caught COVID and now my menstrual cycle has completely stopped. And then others in maybe a smaller community pick that up and they start propagating a message saying that COVID-19 actually prevents the development or further maintenance of women's fertility, or there's some sort of downside on women's fertility. And then that message gets carried on and turns into something over time that then starts to look maybe a bit like misinformation over time, especially as that information void becomes filled with authoritative and verified information from the science community. Well, in that case, in that situation, in a lot of ways we could look at ourselves as the actor. We were the ones spreading what eventually came into misinformation from a stage of rumoring. So you have benign actors, right, who are in the kind of traditional conversation about misinformation and disinformation. We haven't yet touched on how AI amplifies that. But in that traditional conversation, we have ourselves to look at, to think about how it is that we share, how virality plays a part in how what we share gets taken up by something like media organizations or other platforms. So that's one kind of area I like to draw attention to. But then there's two individual stories that come from, one from my own kind of content moderation background, and then one that's been widely reported on, I think, now since 2015. So the first one is, there are a lot of issues in the copyright infringement space where there are a number of streaming websites that come up with new domain names every day. So it used to be putlocker.com or 123movies, And then it evolved to 1, 2, 3, 4 movies, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 movies. And then over and over, there would be requests from brand owners, major studios to say, please take down this site. It's hosting this content illegally, so on and so forth. And as you can imagine back then, as a trust and safety content moderator or investigator in this case, every time there was a new instance of some sort of variable added to 1234movies.com, we had to manually log that into our system to say, okay, our machine learning classifiers should always look out for this term, 1234 movies. But as soon as a new variable was added to that term, we had to reintegrate that into the machine learning classifier. And that was a hugely cumbersome, very manual process. As you can imagine, there are new domains, new pieces of content uploaded every second, right? And so how machine learning has helped that evolve is that there are ways in which these large language models in particular can use what we call kind of contextual reviews to understand how a piece of content or how a domain and its contents on the landing page are currently being used to perhaps showcase IP infringement content, or it's simply a movie review site that actually has nothing to do with infringement. And so that's a really successful case, I think, of how AI can help the abuse fighting efforts that we have, right? So we can scale up, give the LLMs kind of a first pass at the review so they can determine with a confidence score, is this something that is violating a law or a policy or not? And then we keep a human in the loop to review that. But then the second example, I think, when we're talking about who the actor is, that's another case of us being the actors. We're creating those domain names. There's a lot of reporting right now, or that has come out in the last few years, about just who was behind the bot farms that we saw as a product of the initial 2015 campaigns in the US, because political campaign cycles are a lot longer in the States, into the 2016 elections. And there's been pretty wide reporting that they were teenagers from Moldova who were being paid by organizations such as Doppelganger, which is a very well-known influence operations organization. It works as an independent consultant in Russia. And they were 14 and 15-year-olds who were making far above what minimum wage is there to create new accounts on what was then Twitter and YouTube and other places at scale, and essentially have mass comment campaigns or reviews of places, individuals, videos, interactions to sow doubt in what was going on. And in doing so, you're looking at kind of the system of actors in this way. Yes, you have maybe Doppelganger at the core of it, but you also have these vectors of intermediaries who are sometimes children, sometimes influencers, people who with small businesses, or sometimes, again, these more benign actors who are sharing information at scale without maybe AI being involved, but something like virality, without realizing it is, in fact, misinformation. So those are the kind of areas I like to draw attention to, because it is really difficult to gauge intent behind a bad actor, quote. You can have account signals to show that they've done counterfeit sales before. You can have other account signals that show that they have agitated certain communities on a certain forum. But ultimately, there is rarely a smoking gun behind who is a bad actor in this arena, and can we easily target them with the tools we have available, which are our policies and our laws. So it's a tricky endeavor, I think.
Okay, we're going to come on a little bit more to solutions, but I just want to explore a little bit more the problem. So for the media, Mary, you're not likely to be the sort of content creators, but it must be quite difficult to avoid possibly becoming content sharers, notwithstanding Kieran's example. But there's so much out there, and the pressure to get stuff out and report it. How is it thought about, and how do you start to approach how you would identify it and know when to take action when you've just got journalists everywhere looking for a story?
Yes. So I'll just say something very briefly about how machine learning is being used by journalists in a useful way, but then I'll talk more about what you're saying. But again, it's really just to convey that all of this is complex and nuanced, and to think about it carefully, not in a hysterical way. So for instance, it's actually quite useful to use machine learning and templates for very basic sports reporting or very basic finance reporting. If you essentially have a monthly report, which is in format terms always identical, you are just slotting in the numbers from that month, or you're doing a football report, a very short one, where essentially you just want to convey, which teams and the result. Machine learning can be an efficient tool for handling that kind of information, collating it, presenting it, and sharing it. But when it comes more to the fakery side, the deep fake side, and how do the media avoid, unwittingly sharing deep fakes or misinformation or disinformation, or even unwittingly promoting in the way that Kieran touched on, even while drawing attention to something being fake, nonetheless sort of amplifying a fake message. The basic answer is by putting resources into the issue. For years, the BBC, but not just the BBC, all the mainstream responsible media in this country and globally, started to become alert to some of these issues. I mean, they always have been. You've always been wary of what might be propaganda and so on. But, I remember very clear examples in the Iraq War of photographs appearing that, turned out of some incident alleged that turned out to have used a photo that was 3 years old, or the uniforms were wrong. And the first thing we did actually was a team who were very focused on imagery and developed the skills to really just look at the provenance of a photograph, the date, the place, the time. Then the team grew as we got more sophisticated and did start to do things like, well, is that really the right, correct uniform for the IDF? Or, is that the right, is that the description of a square in a village in Syria? I mean, is that actually what the square in that village in Syria looks like? And they became adept and indeed caught some, egregious and regular examples. And then as all of this has become more sophisticated and more complex, so the team has got bigger, the tools, and often actually helped by, pattern recognition technologies and machine learning at combating it. And we were talking about this earlier. We now, the BBC now has a reporter whose beat, if you like, is not, health or foreign affairs or politics. Her beat is misinformation and disinformation, because there are so many stories where we think it is valuable to explain what's going on, to call out what's going on in a calm and informative way, trying to avoid, what you're talking about, which is sort of over-amplification of something, but nonetheless helping to educate and inoculate audiences. And I do think that's a very important public service role. The final thing I would say is that while the mainstream media have invested in this kind of verification, really is ultimately what we're trying to do, so that we can with confidence say to you, the audience and the users, we are confident this information is reliable because we have checked and we have done this, that, the other. This information, however, we do not think is reliable for these reasons. And the mainstream media and news organisations can do a certain amount. But what we've also seen grow up, often funded, frankly, by philanthropy in the States and indeed in this country, are organisations who are dedicated in a really energetic and resourced way, only on this issue, in a sort of investigative and forensic way, using open source technologies to really try and keep ahead of what's going on. So organisations like Bellingcat, or equivalents in the States. And I think that, we should all be grateful to them. They're doing really important work. So I guess that would be an answer to that question.
Thank you. Nahema, you've been very patient, but I think there's something still about the sort of bad actors and the divisions that it's creating, which I think is your...
Sure. I'd love to build on a couple of points that were raised by Anita, actually, and I appreciate you drawing attention to the variety, actually, of actors that may be involved in some forms of misuses that sometimes takes place outside of the political domain, but still have, important ethical ramifications. And the fact this is not always just limited to what we might call or consider malicious actors. And particularly, you're underscoring the importance of financial incentives there. So, as we know, people are motivated by all sorts of goals. One of them, as old as age, is to, try and leverage the tools that are available to them in order to, for example, generate more profit or revenue. And I think that what we're seeing right now is this playing out in real time with what Cory Doctorow, for example, has funnily dubbed the gentrification, of content, in that the widespread availability of certain capabilities, might create incentives from particular types of actors to simply leverage them to create content, which is more or less policy violative, actually, at the model level to increase their reach or maximize revenue. And within the political domain as well, I think what we're seeing is that there are a range of actors involved and not necessarily limited to state actors. Party staffers, campaigners, supporters of political actors are also involved in these forms of misuse that are not, I repeat it, and I think it's important, always very violative of the terms of services or content policies that some of these tools have. I'll give you a particular example that I think is quite salient. We're seeing a couple of cases, for example, which are quite disturbing, of what's been called digital resurrection, and so that often involves giving voice, for example, to people who are deceased, in order to use that as part of advocacy campaign, but sometimes also simply to increase reach or to render content more engaging, which obviously has not only the potential to deceive individuals on the other end, but also comes with I think very important ethical concerns. And so, yeah, I basically think that it's very important to consider, the whole spectrum, essentially, of individuals who may be involved in these forms of misuse, as it does have repercussion for how we think about mitigations and whether this can be better addressed, again, internally or through policies or regulatory efforts. The second point I wanted to address was regarding the use of AI in the context of media and journalism. And I think, as was rightly pointed out just now, one of the key challenges that a lot of media actors face is the sheer increase, actually, of content that needs to be passed, that needs to be verified. And as you rightly stated, there is a lot of evidence that inoculation and pre-bunking can be very effective and are very important to help the public better navigate what they're seeing, and also prevent nefarious effects from exposure to misinformation. But there's some promising evidence that, or indications at least, that AI can and LLMs in particular, can help sort through a lot of the content that comes in to help with both parsing, I would say, and categorization, essentially, which could speed up, I think, down the line the work of fact checkers. We've heard from them that that's one of the main issues that they're facing, and I think that there's promising avenues in this area.
Okay, so moving to the identifying solutions, I think you've all talked about solutions. And I suppose my first question then would be, is this something organic that the tech companies and the media and governments all work their way towards, or are there specific roles for each of those sectors and possibly others, and does it need to be coordinated? And I would remind you that although we're being quite optimistic, what you just said, Nahema, about all this, about the need for inoculation, I would suggest that, for example, in America right now, it's a very febrile atmosphere, and the inoculation is a massive task when you've got so much propensity towards, believing something that isn't necessarily true. Kieran, the spotlight's on you. So if we assume that it is at least in part a problem and a challenge, whose job is it to sort it out?
God, thanks. So, I mean, just a reflection on colleagues' contribution. I mean, as someone who set quite a optimistic, for want of a better word, tone, actually listening to some of this, there are concerns that, they don't alter the overall tone, but I think sometimes we focus on what you might call the big and clever operation, build this exquisite video of some well-known figure and make them say something stupid. But I think, that's quite hard to have impact. There's a really good example. The Russians made this superb deepfake of a Ukrainian TV show after the Moscow terrorist atrocity with the Deputy National Security Advisor purporting to say, we were behind it. And technically, I'm just watching it, it was awesome. The point was nobody believed it. Maybe some people in Russia believed it, but for a start, loads of people had watched the show live and went, well, that didn't happen. And the people who were in the studio said, we didn't say that. So, there is this thing about, yes, you can make these things. I think actually listening to these contributions, one of the things I probably underestimated, and Anita's example of New Hampshire is a good one, is what you might call the smaller, more prolific operation where you just tell people, you send a bunch of emails that look quite smart and say, well, you shouldn't vote for whatever reason if you do it cleverly enough. So, again, I know you want to move to solutions, but there's parts of it, the bits of it that you want to try to do. I think perhaps controversially, and people might have a different view of the impact, the operation run in the US by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, in the 2020 election. They did it without President Trump sort of noticing, and then they ended up firing the person. He ended up firing the person responsible for it after he said the election was the safest in American history after the vote. But one interesting aspect of that, but it does very much depend on trust and authority. They set up this thing called rumor control. So some of Anita's examples, there's invisible ink on the ballots in, I can't remember which state there was, but there were all sorts of stuff like that floating around. And as quickly as possible, they tried, a bit like the BBC Verify thing that Mary was saying, but it was official from government, so that kind of cuts it both ways. They're saying, no, here's some video footage, this is how it works. Now, not everybody believes that, particularly in bitterly polarized America, let alone somewhere as complicated and multilingual and multicultural and physically enormous like India. But there's a bit of that. There's a bit of finding a way. It doesn't have to be government-led, but there's a bit of activism about contesting some of those, small, but you don't need much to sow doubt in people's minds. So there's a bit of that, and that it's really practically difficult because elections are inherently an aggregation of tiny events locally, and you have to be pretty much on it everywhere if you're talking about elections. So there's some of that. There is a bit of technical stuff. We talk a bit about watermarking and so forth. I always thought, and there's some technology. For example, I think there's a spin-off of MIT hoping to try to make it harder to pixelate, to alter the pixels and well-known images, so that it just becomes preposterous if you start to manipulate the images and so forth. So there might be a technical bit. I think there is a little bit about, I think big tech does do this quite well, but the Slovak thing was because I think there was a loophole in Meta's policy about audio, so it left it up for longer. There is a thing about law and other contributory factors to Slovakia was the fact there was a media ban on reporting the electoral contest 48 hours before, so the media couldn't respond. The media couldn't report that there was that this thing that was going viral was a fake. So it's very complicated. The other thing is that I think we we do have to. I hate all these cliches about team sports and team efforts, but in many cases it is true. And there's an element of this of trying to, another word I hate, nudge citizenry into trusting their own instincts in many cases. Now, in bitterly polarised societies, you might want to be a bit careful about that because of the entrenchment of prejudice. But there is a thing around, whatever way we inculcate or try to inculcate values in people, whether it's in schools, homes, whatever, about just, moving sadly to an era where, look, anytime you see a bit of information, can you apply some skeptical judgment to it? I mean, there are some interesting examples of, I think, the way in which this is kind of working. You may have seen when Pakistan had their elections, and of course Imran Khan, as the victor, was in prison, and his team put out this quite wonderful, in my view, fake video, the AI-generated video of his victory speech, and they didn't put any disclaimers on it, as far as I know. But everybody knew this was fake because the man's in prison, so obviously he didn't do it. And it was quite entertaining. This is what we think his victory speech would have looked like had he been at liberty to do it. And there was a certain amount of just, trusting people there. Of course they knew he didn't do it because he was not able to do it. So it's not a great answer, so hopefully you'll get better contributions. But there is something around government, but a mistrusted government is not going to get very far on this. So there is that stock we saw in COVID about what's your level of public capital in the institutions of the state, because if you're going to set up a state body to kind of rebut some of this nonsense, then it better be credible. Or else get somebody else to do it who will be. There is a thing about the technology. There is a thing around big tech. There is a thing around media. But there is also, frankly, a thing around the political system and whether it seeks to capitalize on this stuff or whether it seeks to treat it as an attack on the integrity of the system, which is the Sadiq Khan example. And then there's a thing around an age of skeptical viewing and ingestion of information.
Yes, you're kind of saying who protects the integrity of the political system. Can I just ask you one supplementary question, which is about, do countries help each other? So the Slovakia example is a really good example in the sense that because there would have been presumably options for the EU to do something, but they didn't. I don't know what happened.
I think they do to a point, but it's not very developed. So I think, for example, the easiest example is when, and I think Anita or someone else alluded to this, when there are organised bot farms or, production lines, then, people will try and analyse them together and, if possible, do some operation to put them out of business and, at least set them back a while until they can re-establish it. So that sort of operational thing works well. I don't think there's much political coordination. Your Slovak example is a really good example. No one else was saying it when Slovak law didn't.
You'd think that the EU would say the integrity of the electoral process in the EU is fundamental in some way. Let's coordinate something.
They might, and they're obviously very interested in AI regulation. I may have just missed this, and genuinely might have missed this because I don't follow. It's quite hard to follow all of the AI regulation coming out of Brussels at the moment. But I may have missed parts on that. And they do set up things, on forms of digital security. They do set up sort of collective institutions, mostly for information sharing and so forth. I don't think in terms of, certainly, not least because this would, I think, be seen by many member states as, a pretty serious intrusion into national sovereignty, even in the pooled sovereignty of the EU. They don't have a US-style rumour control service in the election that just squashes, mis and disinformation anywhere in the EU.
So in a way, what you're saying basically is there are limits to how much governments get involved. So then, I was going to turn to our technical representatives. Who wants to go first? Anyone?
Happy to follow up. On the question of the role that model and tech developers can play, I definitely think that technology companies have a responsibility to take proactive measures in order to address these issues. I know that internally at Google DeepMind, this is an issue that we take very, very seriously and quite holistically. And Anita can speak to some of the efforts that exist all across the organization, whether they're policies, initiatives, or programs to ensure that we meet and take appropriate responses to this moment, this big election year. But for us on the research side, what that looks like is conducting ethical research, essentially, to better try and anticipate and also understand the ways in which these technologies, and particularly frontier AI models, are used in practice and maybe misused, in order to create a strong evidence base to devise, mitigation strategies, or even inform the development and deployment of these models in an appropriate way. And just to build on what Kieran was saying before, because I think that's also an interesting example. Some of the ways in which these technologies are currently being used in the context of elections and campaigning falls in this sort of ethical interstice, where we're seeing a lot of multi-level image cultivation, for example, by political candidates who portray themselves in different ways, new forms of hyper-personalized political communication. An example that I think is a sort of funny one is the mayor of London, the mayor of we were talking about Silicon before. The mayor of New York actually using robocalls to try and reach out to constituents in different languages. And so, on the one hand, you can think of this as, genuinely novel, interesting ways to engage with the public and to use these tools to, bring vibrancy to the political space. But on the other hand, this needs to be coupled with, strong, policies and mitigations where you have transparency, on the side of the individuals who actually use tools in this way, who are, informing citizens and the public about the use of AI. And we have policies specifically around this at Google. And you also need, technical solutions around provenance and authenticity in order to be able to better track, essentially, when these tools are being used. And so there is a lot of effort currently within the field, very, at large, to try and create and put out as quickly as possible some of these techniques. I would be the first to acknowledge that they're not always silver bullets, and that the paradox of technical solutions, in a way, is the moment you develop them and put them out, they can become quickly obsolete as capabilities increase, and they obviously can be subverted as well, the moment that they're being rendered public. And so I think for me, what this underscores is the need for continuous monitoring, continuous engagement, and continuous and the creation of adaptable, essentially, solutions and mitigations.
Are the tech companies coordinating with each other? I mean, is there a sort of shared understanding? I don't know, again, do you want
Yeah,
good.
I can start, but
go ahead.
You can continue. Yes, there is definitely coordination. So, for example, Google signed a tech accord recently alongside many other AI developers and companies, took public commitments to both invest in research and the development of technical solutions in the context of deceptive use of AI as part of elections. There's also cross-industry efforts around provenance and authenticity, like the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, which also encourages cross-pollination, basically between labs on these topics.
And in terms of maturity of that, would you say that's a nascent collaborative effort, or it's actually working really well, and there's, in terms of, I'm just trying to get an idea of
No worries. I think that was a very brilliant introduction into what it is that is kind of to your original question, the individual roles that we can expect for each participant in the ecosystem, but also how there does have to be an element of an organic approach to it as well. So I've been kind of keeping track of some of the questions you've followed up with. So from the top, when we talk about should this be an organic collaboration or are there specific roles? Well, it depends on the issue. It depends on the issue and then how it manifests. Because within Google and within a lot of companies, trust and safety as an entity is what we call a matrixed organization. So we work on issue types, so violence against women, violent extremism, but we also work on how it manifests, either through harassment or synthetic pornography, or from recruiting videos to beheading videos, right? And so it matters how it manifests so that you can fill the role modularly according to the needs of the issue. And AI is a lot like that, or AI amplified issues are a lot like that in terms of how the traditional triple helix, the government, academia, and industry can come together to fill in those gaps and understand those roles, which won't always look the same as a different type of issue. So an example I give here is how in the synthetic pornography space, where many of you probably recently heard how there were a number of instances of Taylor Swift's likeness used on pornographic images. And interestingly, in the absence of an actual legal landscape to make that imagery illegal, her team decided to use copyright law. And they said, you are using my likeness, and under copyright law, this entity or this site is profiting off of this, and therefore it should be removed. That's a really novel and interesting way to use a different legal regime, something that the government has put forward, and allows the tech companies to kind of surgically, swiftly, and immediately evaluate the situation and remove it under a legal regime. Whereas sometimes policy regimes, for each platform, it's going to look different. It's going to take a lot more time to negotiate what the issue is and what the solution should be. So that's where I wanted to kind of come with an answer to your question about organic or specific roles. And then to your question about, do countries, whether it's government entities or kind of national champion companies, do they work with each other? Do they talk to each other? The answer is absolutely yes. So sometimes it's through the commissions and the parliament that we see in the EU, but other times it's through these third-party organizations that Nahema definitely listed some of the salient ones for this conversation, but that have been in place for quite a while now. So I wrote a very brief list, but we have the Tech Accord for AI use in elections in particular that we've signed with other AI companies, as well as C2PA for provenance and authenticity. But there are also organizations like GIFCT, which some of you may remember from the Christchurch shooting in New Zealand. There was a rapid response need for tech companies to all come together and coordinate when videos are being published at scale and rapidly to respond and triage a security emergency. And that was a coalition that was born from that. And that's been going since, I think, since about 2015 when that happened. Similarly, partnership on AI, there's a consortium called the Digital Trust and Safety Partnership that exchanges best practices on how, as trust and safety as an industry, which now it's really grown into its own industry, how it is that we can standardize some of the ways in which we triage really escalatory, worrying, kind of acute situations, be it child trafficking issues or a shooting or suspects or suspicions of a tampered voting machine, for example, and the narrative around that. And so some of these are older relationships, some of these are more nascent, and so they are still developing, again, this kind of industry standard that in the absence of sometimes comprehensive legislation, that can fill that gap. And yes, there are limitations to that because that's a voluntary code, right? That's a code of conduct rather than a legal apparatus. But you don't always want a legal apparatus in terms of something like misinformation, right? There have been a number of proposals of this since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where there have been a number of primarily Central and Eastern European countries who have proposed a misinformation law to say that it is illegal to propagate misinformation across products. And primarily the tech companies and social media platforms will be responsible and bear the responsibility for monitoring that. Well, that's interesting because we also have to bear in mind the importance of, in a democracy, the freedom of expression here in Europe and the freedom of speech, which is a constitutional right in the United States. And so when we teeter into the territory of proposing a legal regime, even when it is, unfortunately, a very maybe proliferating issue like misinformation or disinformation further, you want to make sure that there isn't a curbing of civil liberties in exchange for that. That type of dichotomy also applies to the relative privacy and anonymity that we have online. When we talk about who are the bad actors, if we really want to know who the bad actors are, the requirement would be for you to have one single online profile associated with your government ID, and that is all that is used across all platforms, right? So there's a trade-off there where you talk about your personal privacy, so we know who everyone is, and we know who the bad actors are, but also there's that relinquished personal anonymity or privacy that comes online in exchange. That's a kind of a severe example, but those are some of the trade-offs you have to think about when you think about some of the solutions to this question. I can go on a bit more about the different roles of government, civil society, and tech, but ultimately, when it comes to AI exacerbated harms, a lot of the solutions have to be operationalized and operationalized for the trust and safety and similar teams. They have to be able to deploy these solutions in a scalable, manageable way, because there are only so many people a company can employ to monitor the harms as they spread and amplify at scale. So while we're simultaneously investing in LLMs to use to counter abuse, we also have to make sure that there are what we call humans in the loop to review those cases that our LLMs have initially taken a first pass at, to make sure that those calls are sound, those adjudications are justified, and we can move forward with them. And there are only so many hours in the day and so many people we can employ. So whatever solutions that do come from government, civil society, and that local knowledge and tech companies, it has to be deployable and feasible as well.
Thank you, Nita. Now, Mary, I'm giving you the last word before we open to questions from the audience, because I suddenly realised we've not got a lot of time left. But I had one final question as well, which is, how do we know if any of this is working? So.
Well, gosh, okay. I mean, I think on that, we just, we began with the notion of elections and democracy. We just have to keep watching turnouts, and we have to keep watching the handover of power between different parties. And maybe we have to kind of keep an eye on Overton windows and whether they're, we may have division, but that they're not straying into really, far right, far left, extreme or disintegration. Plus the much more detailed kind of research with individuals about their experiences, their perceptions, and this understanding of persuasion. Can I just, as well as answering that, just briefly say a couple of other things, and I will really try not to duplicate what has been said very eloquently to add, although I would definitely, if you hadn't talked about these balances around free speech, as well as controlling harmful speech, or privacy, as well as knowing who's who, then I would have raised them. These are tricky things. And I would also just perhaps want to throw in a little grit to the pearl to say that while I do think the tech companies are collaborating with each other, and indeed with these, multi-actors, governments, technologists, regulators, and so on. I can also tell you that getting information about some of these tech companies, about their algorithms, their API, how they are doing things for us, the public, to really understand is not so easy always. Not necessarily the ones around the table, but some of them. I just also want to say education, very important, and I think educating our children, our youngsters, and all of us to be skeptical but not cynical. And I worried at one point that we were telling kids, especially in schools, almost we were helping them be so distrustful that they were left not able to trust anything. And Nita's talked a lot about trust, and I do think there's something in the end. That's where we end up in a democracy with healthy elections. You want to feel that there's reliable information that we, the public, can trust. And the final point I would make, and I'm really trying not to do a kind of whataboutery thing here, but if we're worried about something, you can either try and reduce the thing we're worrying about, or you can try and increase and support the thing that we actually like. And if we like good information, I would say it would be good if we could spend as much resource and attention on supporting that as in, combating the thing we're worried about. It was World Press Freedom Day last Friday. 28 journalists lost their lives in 2023. 44 environmental journalists have lost their lives since 2014. There are currently something like 1,500 Russian journalists in exile outside Russia. I mean, I could go on with the statistics. I haven't even talked about journalists in jail. I haven't talked about the particular harassment of female journalists, often online and sometimes facilitated by the kind of algorithmic bot technologies we've been talking about. So one of the most important things we could do, I would say, is support the provision of good information and good journalism that allows us to act as good citizens and educators to understand misinformation and disinformation and, collectively all work together to reduce that. So the brilliant sides of this new technology can be also deployed and flourish.
That's a lovely way to end. Thank you very much, Mary. So we've got about a quarter of an hour. Samuel has the microphone, so if you want to ask a question. Oh God, this is terrible. I'm in a terrible chair. Victoria, Victoria? Yes, I think you were first, so speedy.
Sorry, when I said 28 died, I meant 78 last year, just to not put fake news out there.
And please, can you say who you are and where you're from?
Thank you so much for a fantastic panel. I'm Victoria Vdovichenko, I'm visiting fellow from Ukraine, and now I'm within the Center for Geopolitics. And I have actually one comment and two questions, if possible. We talked about elections, we talked about disinformation, but we haven't talked about the impact of AI on propaganda. And that's a very interesting tendency. And I would really want to ask everyone to have a feedback. What do you think now is the new trend on the impact of the AI on propaganda? A second point, we haven't talked about European elections that are coming. I've noticed some of the trends, but it will be very interesting to hear from some of you who is devoted to the research of these current trends. What do you see something different is already happening, that we are 3 weeks before the European elections as of now? Of course, the outcome we will analyze in a half a year, but maybe you see some of the trends that already are evident. Last but not least, is something kind of a trend that I'm observing in some of the foreign media, which is concerned what we say the approach of the peace summit that Ukraine and other countries are preparing. For example, in Italian media, I'm seeing much more materials when Ukrainian is mirroring Russian or Russian is mirroring Ukrainian, and this is used as a precontext. We are beyond all of this stuff. And it's been very much used in the political discourse of some of the parties who wants to, to narrate more of the stories. So what do you see, where is this borderline between when you see that we can analyze it as a / propaganda, / disinformation, / real story, / the impact of the artificial intelligence? Thank you so much, and apologies if it's too much of the question.
Thank you. What I might do is take 3 and then get everybody to answer. So I'm going to the gentleman on the end there.
Hi, thank you all. I'm a member of the public, former PhD student in bioinformatics and molecular biology, so a little bit out of my sort of realm of expertise. But I think one of the things that comes across is the truth is quite hard to ascertain, and maybe algorithms will help us a little bit. But my question is really around sort of errors or mistakes where something that was true was classified as disinformation or misinformation and had serious ramifications. And I guess this ties to the studies around how do we actually find the balance. But I'd love to hear the opinion of the panelists on the idea of mischaracterizing correct information as disinformation.
Thank you. And then the lady with the green socks. And the
Hi, thank you all for a great panel. I'm a PhD student here in gender studies. I heard the word agency come up earlier, so I have a question about consent. I know you had mentioned synthetic pornography. So, what do the conversations look like when it comes to individuals needing to grapple with the use of their image and likeness for very disturbing practices like that, but also when it comes to, creative outputs, writing, art, music that's then being fed into AI to create artificially then created outputs that are going to have economic harms in return. So what do the conversations look like at these boundaries between consent, and how can individuals actually navigate how their faces, their voices, their likenesses are used by these technologies? Thank you.
Thank you. Right. I'm going to just work down this. So Kieran first.
I'll be quick. This is really hard because the questioners are asking all the things that we avoided because they were too complicated. Two quick reflections. I think one is, and it's a danger that we haven't talked about, partly raised by the point about propaganda, partly the point about errors, which is, there is a body of opinion that worries in this conversation about the shutting down of dissenting voices and what is, and obviously there's a porous border between propaganda and unpopular opinions. Facts do sometimes change or at least evolve. So all I'm going to say is I think that's a great point, and we do have to think about it. And very often, I mean, this came out. There was a House of Lords committee inquiring into this, into the future of news, and we ended up having quite an interesting discussion where I said, yes, but the way you're talking, you're almost inadvertently recommending the establishment of some sort of truth regulator, into which organ of government, even in a relatively institutionally stable country like this one, to which organ of government do you wish to give that job? So there's going to be imperfections here. I think the other point, and I think I need to allude to this briefly, but it's a huge issue and it's a whole seminar in its own right. Everything from the single image of a person that's violated for awful purposes, but again, we heard really interesting stuff around copyright. There's a whole bunch of economic and legal issues about the creative arts. I think Mary, in her concluding remarks, alluded to it about about supporting institutions and commercial and public institutions that provide high quality content. And I think, I don't know how this will end, it's way outside my area of expertise, but it's a bit like, in the late 90s when every reputable news outlet started having a website and it was all free, and then they realized, well, everybody's, nobody's watching TV or reading newspapers anymore, they're all reading this online and it's free, we can't make any money, and they've moved to a different model. I suspect, but at least two members of the panel have greater expertise on this than me, I suspect at some point in terms of AI using, creative content, there's going to have to be a different economic and legal model. What that looks like, I defer to others.
European elections can't get away without.
Honestly, I think, most of what, I forgot about that one, but mostly I would fall back on what I said, earlier. I think there may be a couple of instances where, something big and or something at least prominent and concerning happens. So, mindful of not completely devaluing the integrity of continental-wide elections, I would look at two things. One is, was it interesting? Was it interesting and impactful, or just interesting? That's a really important distinction, right? And then the second one, if it is impactful, proceed to question two, which is, what can you learn from it? Because Slovakia actually, there's part of it which is easily fixed, Meta's removals policy, which has been fixed, and Slovak law, which I don't think has. And then, of course, there were it was a deeply polarized country, and don't blame technology for that.
Thank you. Nahema.
I'll also try to be quick, acknowledging that each of these questions could take half an hour. But quickly on the question of classifying true information as misinformation and the impact of that. I think that point's been raised both by Kieran and Elida, but I would underscore it again of the caution that we need to take around creating like legal and policy regimes around notions like misinformation that are still and disinformation, which are still essentially contested. And I say that with my research scientist hat on. Something that's legally binding has to be definable in that sense. And I think we're already seeing some of the impact of that in the form of what's called a liar's dividend. The fact that sometimes individuals, politicians in various parts or public figures can sort of de-responsibilize themselves. When being accused of committing certain acts, simply by politicizing, evidence and calling it, AI generated, or say that it's misinformation. We've seen that happen already with the politicization of the term fake news, and so I think these are very serious, potential ramifications that needs to be taken into account. And then on the question of consent, I think that's an excellent point, and we are at this hugely critical juncture. I think to Marie's point about the importance of educating the public and equipping individuals, especially private individuals, with the tools that they need to better navigate, essentially, the informational space of tomorrow. We live in a world in which people have all sorts of information available online, including their own likeness. Sometimes that's absolutely vital, to people's individual businesses, and just it's part and parcel of their lives. And so I think increasing, literacy around how to better protect oneself and how to, effectively exercise, restraint and privacy controls online is going to be fundamental.
So, quick rattle at some of these. I mean, the EU elections, well, yes, we'll have to see, and maybe there'll be a bit of what we've seen elsewhere, and as Kieran says, it probably won't make much difference. And actually, I'd have thought the bigger question with the European elections is just how to galvanise and get people to vote in a kind of analogue real-world way, even before you get to worrying about any fake news. I think issues like, consent and so on, I'm not expert on at all. I mean, all I would say is that we just are all having to kind of run to keep up, and we will carry on having to run to keep up because these new technologies throw up these very complex, ethical and practical questions, and it's really important therefore to talk and bring people together in the right coalitions to tackle things. The creativity aspects, again, I mean, we're at a moment where a whole new set of things is possible, and then we will go through a moment of working out what to preserve from that, what we need to corral, what to control, and how do we make sure that creativity and original creativity and intellectual property in effect can be rewarded, but it's not easy. There've always been borrowings and inspiration, and we'll have to navigate our way through all these different elements. We haven't even talked about plagiarism and the challenges that AI has thrown up in an academic and other environments about, borrowing, and maybe let's just sort of not go there. But actually, in a way, I've seen quite quickly, even over a period of almost 18 months, a sort of, we all throw our hands up in horror, then we have some actually quite nuanced conversations. People try certain things, get some boundaries around things, facilitate other things, and things calm down, and we're sort of working these things through. But you're absolutely right that I think for the artistic community, often a not well-paid community, getting some answers around all of this, before too long really matters to them, because, it's livelihoods as well as reputation.
Right.
These are all really great questions, and when I go in order, I was furiously writing, so I was listening. I hope you felt like I was listening. So when we talk about the question on what about propaganda, what about essentially triaging the issue of what is effectively, typically, government-sponsored misinformation or certain messages that are pressed into the information ecosystem to persuade, to subdue the voting populace or the citizenry. That's a tricky one from the company's perspective as well, because there are very active and live instances of that. We have what we call demonstrably false claims being made by heads of government all the time. And when you think about demonstrably false claims baked into kind of a coordinated informational manipulation system, then we're talking about propaganda. And so, like I said, making the distinction of intent has to be done, but it's also very tricky. And then how do you manage that? Well, rather than leaning on the legal codes within that country, because chances are, if a government is responsible for pushing disinformation, chances are they're going to have not the best legal codes for us to work alongside. That's when we have to kind of default to what within the kind of Google ecosystem, what our policies are, and make sure that our policies, which are informed by international human rights codes, declarations, and agreements, that we can take action, yes, even on government entities according to those codes, and hold really all actors accountable where possible. So it's something we try to do. We don't get it right all the time, but it is something that, while tricky, is something we have teams working on. When we talk about the European elections, one of the best decisions, I think it was a commission that came out with this, was something between 3 weeks to a month and a half. Political advertising had to be suspended prior to the election itself. I think that was a very good decision, personally. I don't know if Google agrees with me, but I do. And the reason being is that it allows for more analog, real-time conversation amongst the citizenry, rather than that kind of final push we see in the New Hampshire example I gave you with the robocalls. it sees more of an organic exchange across the voting populace. And then similarly, if there is going to be any kind of advertising ahead of an election, if AI is leveraged and there's synthetically generated imagery, that's something that I strongly encourage and really advocate for better disclosure requirements across the platforms themselves. So if you're going to allow this type of advertising on your platform, please make sure that a user and a voter knows that it's synthetically generated. It may not change their vote. It may not manipulate or persuade them in any one way, but I personally believe they have the right to know. So those are some of the kind of considerations there. But in terms of trends, I haven't quite seen something of note quite yet before the elections. Maybe we'll learn some after. When it comes to the question on what we call false positives, so a mistake that categorizes something that is a truth as false. I don't personally know of many instances of this. I'm sure there are. This is kind of what happens when you're operationalizing a set of policies, especially after a first go of a change or an update. You're going to have false negatives and false positives. I think where we want to be careful about false positives, it's going to depend on the topic. So where you really don't want a false positive, for example, is in the case of child sexual abuse material, right? Because you are sometimes categorizing an adult as a child in a sexual position, and that may affect how it is that they triage that issue after the fact. It's not the worst thing in the world. We'd rather have a false positive than a false negative, because at least then we are catching the material we think could possibly be CSAM. But ultimately, it is a risk that we run. In the issue of kind of authoritative, verifiable truths, if you will, or facts, if it's classified as a false positive, as disinformation, for example, or misinformation, the repercussions of that are still quite big, but it may not be as immediate as a threat to life situation like that former one is. So we have to be able to triage those situations accordingly. Again, that's not to say it's not impactful potentially, but it's something that we have to kind of gauge in the priority matrix of other issues. But it's a really good consideration, and I'll actually be on the lookout for instances of that as well. On the last question about consent under the kind of pornographic sense and the synthetic pornography to the creative industries, on the former, that's really interesting, and we actually have a trust and safety research team that consulted with former sex workers, former victims of non-consensual explicit imagery to hear what their stories were like when navigating the removal request process for removing their likeness online, whether they've exited the sex industry and they just don't want to be associated with that anymore, and they want to remove any indication of that from our search index, or they were simply a victim of a relationship abuse and they want all evidence of that taken offline. We actually conducted pretty extensive research on that, and we actually updated our policy and the visibility of resources and tools for those individuals to remove their information and remove all their name association to that content. It took a long time, but we have to be thorough when we talk about policy updates, because we have to make sure we're thinking about all the cascading ways it could affect other types of issues. So I was really happy to see that after as much time as it took to make that change. On the latter, on the creative industries piece, that's something I'm not really directly privy to, but it is a very important juncture, like Nahema mentioned, that we are at a point where we're trying to figure out what does this information and creative engagement model look like that can benefit the players that are currently in that arena. And that has to center and really focus on the individual creators themselves as AI does train on these models of data, creative output, and information. So I think there are good faith engagements to try to find a settling ground, and there's a lot of really interesting references like into plagiarism versus borrowing that we can look to, but I'll also be watching that conversation.
Anita, thank you very much. We have now overrun, so I haven't done this very well. A number of you have got questions still, but the good news is that when the evil Iron Curtain is raised again, there's drinks there, and we're all going to be here until at least 7 o'clock, so please come down and direct your questions directly to the panel. And I'd like to say thank you very much to our fantastic panelists for the session.